The wind cut through Blackridge Canyon like a knife that night, carrying with it the scent of pine and something darker, something final. Emily Carter stood at the edge of the cliff, her hand instinctively moving to her belly where 6 months of life grew beneath her coat. The moon hung low, partially obscured by clouds that moved too fast across the sky, casting shadows that danced across the rocks below. She couldn't see the bottom. No one ever could at night. That's what made this place so terrifying, so absolute in its promise of oblivion. "You don't understand what you're asking me to give up," Nathan said behind her, his voice steady in a way that made her skin crawl. Not angry, not pleading, just cold. Emily turned to face her husband, searching his eyes for something she'd seen there 3 years ago when he'd proposed on a beach in Malibu. Warmth, love, possibility. But tonight, standing in the howling wind with gravel crunching beneath their feet, she saw only calculation. The kind of look a man gives when he's already made his decision and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. "I'm asking you to be honest," Emily said, pulling her coat tighter. "That's all I've ever asked. Just tell me the truth about Lydia. Tell me what's really going on with the money. Tell me why you've been meeting with your accountant at midnight. Tell me." "Enough." The word came out sharp, final. Nathan took a step toward her, and Emily took a step back. Her heel caught on loose rock. She stumbled, catching herself, but the momentary loss of balance sent her heart racing. She was too close to the edge. Way too close. "Nathan, can we please just go home? We can talk about this somewhere safe." "There's nothing to talk about," he said, and something in his tone made Emily's blood turn to ice. "You've been digging, Emily. Going through my files. Talking to people you shouldn't be talking to. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy educational stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too." Emily's mind raced back to 3 days ago, when she'd found the insurance policy in Nathan's desk drawer. $2.8 million. A policy he'd taken out 6 months ago, right around the time she'd told him she was pregnant. Right around the time she'd started noticing the late-night phone calls, the unexplained absences, the way Lydia Moore looked at her husband during business meetings with eyes that held too many secrets. "I'm your wife," Emily said, and she hated how her voice trembled. "I have a right to know what's happening with our finances. With our life. With..." Nathan moved so fast, she didn't have time to react. His hand connected with her shoulder. Not a punch, not even a particularly hard shove, just enough force to send her already unsteady body backward. Emily's arms windmilled, grasping at empty air. Her scream caught in her throat as gravity claimed her. The last thing she saw was Nathan's face, illuminated by moonlight, watching her fall with an expression that would haunt her for years to come. Not horror, not regret, just cold, clinical observation, like a scientist watching an experiment reach its inevitable conclusion. The impact came in stages. First, a jarring collision with an outcropping 20 feet down that sent lightning bolts of pain through her ribs. Then a sickening tumble through brush and rock, her body a ragdoll controlled by physics and chance. Finally, a splash as she hit the shallow rapids at the canyon's base, the icy water swallowing her whole. Darkness. Emily Carter, age 29, intelligent, trusting, quietly wealthy from a family inheritance her grandmother had left her, disappeared into the night. Above, Nathan stood at the edge for exactly 45 seconds. He'd later tell police he was in shock, before walking back to his car and driving to the nearest ranger station to report a terrible accident. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand who Emily Carter was before she became a body in a canyon. She'd grown up in Connecticut, the daughter of a literature professor and a piano teacher, both of whom died in a car accident when she was 23. The inheritance that followed, nearly $4 million from her grandmother's estate, had been both a blessing and a curse. It made her independent. It also made her a target. Nathan Carter had swept into her life 2 years after her parents' death, when she was still navigating grief and trying to figure out who she was without them. He was 10 years older, charismatic in the way that successful men often are, with perfectly styled hair and a smile that made promises his character couldn't keep. He developed high-end properties in Colorado, turning abandoned warehouses into luxury lofts, vacant lots into boutique hotels. He talked about vision, about legacy, about building something that mattered. Emily had fallen for him hard and fast. They married within a year, a small ceremony in Stonehaven with 50 guests and a string quartet that played while snow fell gently outside the windows. She'd worn her grandmother's pearls. Nathan had written his own vows. She should have paid more attention to the fact that he'd never once mentioned love in those vows. Only partnership, only future, only the life they'd build together. Lydia Moore had entered their lives 6 months into the marriage, introduced as a business consultant who specialized in development financing. She was 34, sharp-featured, with dark hair she wore pulled back so tightly it looked painful. She dressed in power suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent and spoke in crisp, declarative sentences that left no room for argument. Nathan had hired her to help secure financing for his largest project yet, a mixed-use development in downtown Stonehaven that would require $12 million in backing. Emily had tried to like Lydia. She'd invited her to dinner parties, made conversation about market trends and interest rates even though finance bored her to tears. But there was something in the way Lydia looked at Nathan, something in the way they'd fall silent when Emily entered a room, something in the 3 a.m. phone calls Nathan would take on the balcony, his voice too low to hear, but his body language screaming intimacy. When Emily had finally confronted him 2 months ago, Nathan had laughed it off. Lydia? You think I'm sleeping with Lydia? Jesus, she's my business partner. That's it. You're being paranoid. But Emily had seen the hotel receipt in his jacket pocket. She'd noticed the text that disappeared from his phone. She'd driven past Lydia's apartment one night and seen Nathan's car parked outside, still there at 2 in the morning when she'd circled back. The insurance policy had been the final piece. $2.8 million, with Nathan as the sole beneficiary. When she'd asked him about it, he'd explained it away with practiced ease. It's standard for someone in my position, honey. The development deal requires it. The bank wants to make sure my assets are protected if anything happens to me. But I'm the policy holder, Emily had said, her voice barely a whisper. Not you. That's when his face had changed. That's when she'd seen something dark flicker behind his eyes, there and gone in an instant. You're overthinking this, he'd said. You're emotional because of the pregnancy. It's making you see threats where there aren't any. Gaslighting. Emily had recognized it for what it was. She'd read enough psychology books during her grief counseling years to know manipulation when it stared her in the face. But knowing something and being able to escape it were two different things. Especially when the person doing the manipulating controlled your finances, your social circle, your entire life. So when Nathan had suggested a drive to clear the air, a romantic evening looking at the stars over Blackridge Canyon, Emily had agreed despite every instinct screaming at her to run. She'd told herself she was being paranoid. She'd told herself that the father of her unborn child couldn't hurt her. She'd been catastrophically wrong. The search began at dawn. Rangers combed Blackridge Canyon with trained dogs and thermal imaging equipment, looking for any sign of Emily Carter. Nathan played the devastated husband perfectly, his voice breaking at all the right moments as he recounted the story to police. They'd been standing near the edge, talking. The wind had picked up. Emily had lost her balance. He'd reached for her, but missed. She'd fallen. I should have held on tighter, he told Detective Sarah Brennan, tears streaming down his face on cue. I keep replaying it in my mind. If I'd just grabbed her hand 1 second sooner. Brennan, a 20-year veteran who'd seen her share of convenient accidents, watched Nathan carefully. Something felt off about his grief. It was too polished, too practiced. But without a body, without witnesses, without any evidence of foul play, her hands were tied. Accidents happened, especially at places like Blackridge Canyon, where every year someone got too close to the edge and gravity claimed another victim. The search continued for 10 days. They found Emily's phone, shattered on the rocks. They found blood on an outcropping. DNA confirmed it was hers. But they never found a body. The rapids at the base of the canyon fed into a river system that eventually emptied into a reservoir 15 miles downstream. If Emily had survived the fall, unlikely given the distance and the rocks, she would have been swept away by the current, possibly caught under debris or pulled into underwater caves that honeycombed the canyon walls. On day 11, the official search was called off. Emily Carter was declared missing, presumed dead. The memorial service was held on a gray afternoon at Stonehaven Community Church, with white lilies and a closed casket that held only photographs and memories. Nathan delivered a eulogy that had people weeping in the aisles, talking about Emily's kindness, her intelligence, her excitement about becoming a mother. He never mentioned the baby directly. That would have been too much, too raw, but everyone knew. Everyone felt the double tragedy of a mother and child lost together. What they didn't know was that Lydia Moore sat in the back row, wearing dark sunglasses and a black dress that screamed widow more than mistress. What they didn't know was that 3 days after the memorial, Nathan filed the life insurance claim. What they didn't know was that within 6 weeks, Nathan would receive a check for $2.8 million, minus fees and taxes. What they didn't know was that Nathan Carter and Lydia Moore would leave Stonehaven within 3 months, relocating to Atlanta where Nathan would invest the insurance money in a new development deal that would make them both very rich. What they didn't know was that 15 miles downstream, on a muddy bank where the river slowed and curved through private property, a woman who no longer remembered her own name had washed ashore in the pre-dawn hours of that terrible night, barely breathing, her body broken but alive. Ruth Holloway had been living off-grid for 7 years, ever since she'd retired from 30 years of emergency nursing and decided she'd had enough of humanity's noise. Her cabin sat on 40 acres of inherited land, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that most people didn't know existed. She lived simply, solar panels for electricity, a well for water, a garden for food, and blessed, beautiful silence. She was checking her fishing lines at dawn when she saw the body tangled in the roots of a fallen tree. For a moment, Ruth thought it was a deer. They sometimes drown during heavy rains, their carcasses floating downstream until something caught them. But as she got closer, she realized with horror that it was a woman, face down in the shallows, one arm twisted at an unnatural angle, blood seeping from a gash on her temple. Ruth was 71 years old. She'd seen death more times than she could count. She knew the difference between a corpse and someone who still had fight left in them. This woman, young, pregnant, broken, still had a pulse. Faint, thready, barely there, but present. Getting her out of the water nearly killed them both. The woman was deadweight, unconscious, and Ruth wasn't as strong as she used to be. But adrenaline and decades of emergency training kicked in. She dragged the woman onto the bank, assessed her injuries with practiced efficiency, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She didn't call 911. Ruth had lived long enough to recognize the signs of intimate partner violence. The bruising on the woman's arms, defensive wounds. The way she'd clearly fallen from a significant height, but had no identification, no phone, nothing to indicate who she was. The fact that someone this injured, this close to death, had ended up in the water at all suggested violence, not accident. If Ruth called for help and the person who'd hurt this woman was still out there, they'd finish the job. If Ruth called for help and this woman was running from something, the system would pull her back into danger. Ruth had seen it happen too many times during her nursing career. Women returned to abusive partners, protective orders that were worth less than the paper they were printed on, victims who begged her not to call the police because it would only make things worse. So Ruth made a choice. She would save this woman herself. And if that woman wanted to vanish, Ruth would help her do that too. The first 72 hours were critical. Ruth set up a makeshift ICU in her cabin, using supplies she'd stockpiled over the years, the paranoia of a former trauma nurse who believed in being prepared for anything. The woman had broken ribs, internal bleeding that Ruth could only monitor and hope would resolve on its own, a severe concussion, and countless lacerations and contusions that painted her body in shades of purple and black. But the head injury was the worst. Ruth recognized the signs of traumatic brain damage, the unequal pupils, the periods of unconsciousness that lasted too long, the occasional seizures that racked the woman's body with terrifying intensity. When the woman finally opened her eyes on the 4th day, Ruth knew immediately that something fundamental had been lost. "Where am I?" the woman whispered, her voice raw from disuse. "You're safe," Ruth said, adjusting the 4 lines she'd placed in the woman's arm. "My name is Ruth. You washed up on my property. You've been badly hurt." "I don't." The woman's eyes filled with panic. "I don't remember. I don't remember anything. Who am I? What happened? Why can't I remember?" Ruth had seen retrograde amnesia before, usually temporary, a side effect of trauma that faded as the brain healed. But as days turned into weeks and the woman's physical injuries began to heal while her memories remained locked away, Ruth realized this was something more permanent. Whatever had happened to this woman, whatever fall or blow she'd sustained, had severed her connection to her past completely. "What should I call you?" Ruth asked one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the river. The woman could walk now, slowly, one hand pressed to her still-healing ribs. Her pregnancy had somehow survived the trauma, though Ruth worried constantly about complications she couldn't detect without proper medical equipment. "I don't know," the woman said, and her voice cracked with grief for a life she couldn't remember. "How can I not know my own name? How can I not know who I am?" "Then we'll give you one," Ruth said gently. "Just for now. Just until you remember. What about Claire? You look like a Claire to me." The woman, Claire, tested the name in her mouth like foreign food, rolling it around, seeing if it fit. "Claire," she whispered. "Okay, I'm Claire." But being Claire meant accepting that whoever she'd been before was gone, possibly forever. The fragments that sometimes surfaced in dreams, flashes of a cliff, a man's face, the sensation of falling, were too scattered, too nightmarish to piece together into a coherent narrative. Claire didn't know if those were memories or trauma-induced hallucinations. She didn't know if someone was looking for her or if she'd been abandoned. She didn't know if she should grieve for her lost identity or be grateful for the chance to start over. The pregnancy complicated everything. Claire went into labor at 32 weeks, 8 weeks premature, in Ruth's cabin with no medical backup and no way to handle complications if they arose. Ruth had delivered babies before, dozens of them during her years in the ER, but never like this, never in a cabin in the woods with a patient who didn't remember her own name and a baby whose chances of survival decreased with every minute they remained isolated from proper medical care. "I have to get you to a hospital," Ruth said as Claire's contractions intensified, coming faster now. "Too fast. The baby's in distress. I can hear it in your breathing. We need to go now." "No," Claire gasped between contractions, her face slick with sweat. "No hospitals. They'll ask questions. They'll want to know who I am. They'll—" Another contraction hit, stealing her words. When she could breathe again, she locked eyes with Ruth. "Please, just help me. You're a nurse. You've done this before. Please." So Ruth delivered the baby in her cabin, using clean towels and prayers and 30 years of experience that she prayed would be enough. The baby boy came out small but breathing, his cry weak but present, and for a moment, Claire smiled through her exhaustion. But that smile faded when Ruth examined the infant more carefully and realized what Claire's body had already known. This baby needed medical intervention immediately. "His breathing isn't right," Ruth said quietly. "His color isn't right. Claire, honey, I know you're scared, but this baby needs a NICU. He needs oxygen and monitoring and—" "Then take him," Claire said, and her voice was hollow, empty of everything but grief. "Take him to the hospital. Tell them you found him abandoned. Tell them anything. But don't tell them about me. Please, Ruth. I'm begging you. Don't tell them about me." Ruth wanted to argue. She wanted to shake this young woman and tell her that running from danger wasn't worth losing her child. But she looked into Claire's eyes and saw something that stopped her cold. Absolute certainty that whoever had hurt her would hurt this baby too if given the chance. Whether that was true or simply trauma speaking, Ruth couldn't be sure. But she couldn't risk it. So Ruth bundled the baby boy in clean blankets, drove 40 miles to the nearest hospital, and left him in the emergency room entrance with a note pinned to his blanket. "Found him by the river. He needs help. Please take care of him." The hospital staff found the baby within minutes. They rushed him to the NICU, ran every test, searched for any identification or clue about his origins. They found nothing. No missing infant reports matched his description. No frantic parents came forward. The baby became a ward of the state, designated as abandoned, placed into foster care as soon as he was medically stable. Back at the cabin, Claire wept for 3 days straight. Ruth held her while she sobbed, offering no platitudes, no false comfort. Some losses were too great for words. Some sacrifices left wounds that never fully healed. "He's safe," Ruth said finally, when Claire's tears had run dry. "That's what matters. He's safe, and he's being cared for. The foster system will place him with a good family. He'll have a life. He'll be okay." "Will I ever see him again?" Claire asked, and her voice was the voice of a child asking if monsters were real. Ruth didn't lie to her. "I don't know, honey. I honestly don't know." 6 months passed in Ruth's cabin. 6 months of healing, both physical and psychological, though the scars from both ran deep. Claire's body mended, the ribs knitted back together, the internal injuries resolved, the concussion symptoms faded to occasional headaches that came and went like unwelcome visitors. But her memories remained locked away, buried behind a wall her brain had constructed to protect itself from something too terrible to face. Ruth never pushed. She'd learned during her nursing career that trauma revealed itself on its own timeline, not according to anyone's schedule or preference. Instead, she gave Claire space to exist, to breathe, to slowly piece together a sense of self that wasn't dependent on remembering who she'd been before. They fell into a routine. Claire helped Ruth with the garden, learning the names of plants she somehow knew how to tend despite having no conscious memory of ever gardening before. She cooked meals using recipes that appeared in her mind fully formed, muscle memory that bypassed the broken pathways of explicit recall. She read voraciously from Ruth's extensive library, psychology books, mostly, though she couldn't have explained why those particular volumes called to her. "I think I need to leave," Claire said one evening, as summer began transitioning to fall and the first cold winds whistled through the trees surrounding Ruth's property. "Not because I'm not grateful. I am. You saved my life, Ruth. But I can't stay here forever. I can't hide forever." Ruth had been expecting this conversation. She'd seen the restlessness building in Claire over the past weeks, the way her eyes tracked every car that passed on the distant highway, the way she'd started asking questions about the nearest town, about how someone could start over with no identification, no history, no proof they'd ever existed. "Where will you go?" Ruth asked. "Away from Colorado," Claire said immediately. "I don't know why, but this state feels wrong. Dangerous. Like something bad happened here." She pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to summon memories that refused to surface. "I keep dreaming about mountains and wind and falling. I think someone pushed me. I think someone tried to kill me." "Then we need to make sure you're safe," Ruth said. "Not just physically safe, but legally safe. You need an identity, Claire. Real documentation. A social security number. A driver's license. The ability to exist in the world without constantly looking over your shoulder." What Ruth did next was illegal by every definition of the word, but she did it anyway because she'd spent 30 years watching the system fail vulnerable people, and she wasn't about to let it fail Claire. She had contacts from her nursing days, people who existed in the gray spaces between legal and criminal, people who specialized in helping those who needed to disappear for their own safety, battered women, witnesses who testified against dangerous criminals, people like Claire who carried trauma in their bones and couldn't trust the official channels to protect them. Within 2 months, Claire had a new identity. Not just a fake ID, but a complete paper trail, a birth certificate from a small town in Montana, social security records that showed employment history at various retail and service jobs, even a GED certificate from a correspondence program. The identity was solid enough to withstand casual inspection, though it would never survive a deep background check by law enforcement. But for the purposes of renting an apartment, opening a bank account, and applying to community college, it was perfect. Ruth drove Claire to Ashford, Oregon, a mid-sized city 3 states away where nobody knew her and nobody would think to look for a woman who was supposed to be dead. They said goodbye in the parking lot of a cheap motel, both women crying despite their best efforts not to. "You saved me," Claire said, holding Ruth tight. "I don't know who I was before, but I know who I want to be now. Thank you for giving me that chance." "You saved yourself," Ruth replied, pulling back to look Claire in the eyes. "All I did was get you back on your feet. What you do next, that's all you, honey. Make it count." Claire watched Ruth's truck disappear down the highway, carrying with it the last tangible connection to whoever she'd been before the fall. Then she turned toward the motel, toward the small room that would be her home for the next month while she figured out her next move, and she made a decision that would shape everything that followed. She would become someone who helped people like her, people who'd been broken by trauma, who'd lost themselves to violence or grief or circumstances beyond their control. She would study psychology. She would learn how the human mind processed trauma, how it built walls and erected defenses, and sometimes shattered completely under pressure. She would become an expert in the architecture of survival. She would become Dr. Mira Lawson. The transformation took 8 years. For years for a bachelor's degree in psychology from Portland State University, where Claire, now using the name Mira Lawson full-time, threw herself into her studies with the intensity of someone making up for lost time. She graduated summa cum laude, her thesis on dissociative amnesia and identity reconstruction earning praise from professors who had no idea they were reading about their students' own lived experience. For more years for a doctorate in clinical psychology, specializing in trauma survivors and post-traumatic stress disorder, Mira conducted research studies, published papers in academic journals, completed her clinical hours at a therapy center that served domestic violence survivors. She was brilliant, her professors agreed. Insightful in a way that suggested deep personal understanding of suffering, though she never discussed her own history, always redirecting conversations back to the research, the data, the clients. By the time Mira Lawson hung her shingle at a private practice in Ashford, she'd built a reputation as one of the most effective trauma therapists in the Pacific Northwest. Her specialty was working with survivors who'd lost themselves, people dealing with amnesia, dissociative disorders, PTSD, so severe it had fractured their sense of identity. She had a gift for helping people piece themselves back together, for teaching them that who they became after trauma was just as valid, just as real, as who they'd been before. She never told her clients that she practiced what she preached. Never mentioned that she herself didn't remember the first 29 years of her life, that her earliest clear memories began in a cabin by a river with a kind woman who'd given her a second chance at existence. Some stories were too raw to share, even in a therapy room built on trust and vulnerability. But the fragments kept coming. Not full memories. Those remained frustratingly out of reach. But sensations, flashes, moments that felt more like echoes than recollections. A man's cologne that made her stomach turn when a client wore it. The sound of gravel crunching underfoot that sent her heart racing. The sight of a cliff at sunset that filled her with inexplicable dread. And the dreams. Always the dreams. A figure standing above her, silhouetted against the moon. The sensation of falling. A voice saying words she could never quite catch upon waking. The dreams increased in frequency and intensity as the years passed, as if whatever wall her mind had constructed to protect her was slowly, inevitably crumbling. Then came the debate. Mira was at home on a Tuesday evening, half watching the television while reviewing case notes for a client she'd be seeing the next morning. It was a local political debate, something she'd normally ignore entirely, but one of her colleagues had texted to say they should watch because one of the candidates was discussing mental health policy and actually seemed informed about the issues. Mira glanced up at the screen, pen still in hand, and her entire world stopped. The man on screen was tall, well-dressed, silver touching his temples in a way that suggested distinguished rather than old. He was speaking passionately about development policy, about bringing jobs to underserved communities, about vision and legacy, and building something that mattered. His voice was confident, practiced, the kind of voice that made promises it had no intention of keeping. Nathan Carter, city council candidate, Ravenport, Georgia. The pen slipped from Myra's fingers. The case notes scattered across the floor. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at the face on screen and feel 8 years of locked memories come crashing down like a dam breaking under too much pressure. She knew this man. She knew his voice, his mannerisms, the way he smiled without warmth reaching his eyes. She knew the cologne he wore, the same one that had made her nauseous when her client had worn it last month. She knew the way he gestured when he spoke, the slight tilt of his head that suggested he was listening when really he was just waiting for his turn to talk again. The memories came in a flood, disjointed, chaotic, terrible. Walking through a house she'd shared with him. Discovering papers that didn't make sense. Confronting him about money. About a woman named Lydia, about lies that had piled so high she couldn't see over them anymore. The drive to the canyon. The wind. The argument. His hand on her shoulder. The fall. Oh God, the fall. Myra's hands shook as she grabbed her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard with desperate intensity. Nathan Carter, she typed. Stonehaven, Colorado. Her search pulled up dozens of results, years' worth of news articles and business profiles. She clicked through them with mounting horror. piecing together the story of her own erasure. Woman missing, presumed dead after fall at Blackridge Canyon. Search called off after 10 days. Memorial service held. Husband receives insurance payout. Couple relocates to Atlanta. Development deal succeeds. New project announced. Rising political star. Family man. Visionary developer. American success story. And in every photo from the past 5 years, standing beside Nathan Carter with a smile that suggested she knew exactly what she'd helped him get away with, was Lydia Moore. Now Lydia Carter, according to the most recent articles. They'd married 18 months after Emily's death, a quiet ceremony with no fanfare, no press coverage beyond a small announcement in the Atlanta social pages. Mira stared at the photos until her vision blurred. The woman she'd been. Emily Carter, age 29, wealthy, trusting, pregnant, had been erased as completely as if she'd never existed. Nathan had taken her money, taken her life, taken her child, and used it all to build himself into something respectable, something admirable. He was running for city council. He was being profiled in business magazines. He was living the life he'd always wanted, unencumbered by the wife he'd murdered and the son he'd never known existed. The rage that filled Mira was cold, calculated, surgical. This wasn't the hot anger of immediate betrayal. She'd had 8 years to process her trauma, 8 years to rebuild herself into someone stronger than the woman who'd fallen from that cliff. This was the fury of someone who'd clawed her way back from death only to discover that her murderer had suffered no consequences, faced no justice, lived without fear or remorse. She couldn't go to the police. What evidence did she have? A traumatic brain injury that had stolen her memories for 8 years? A suspicion based on fragments and dreams? The fact that she'd created a new identity using falsified documents, making her legally a different person than Emily Carter? No prosecutor would touch this case. No jury would convict based on the testimony of a woman who'd spent nearly a decade believing she was someone else. But Mira Lawson wasn't Emily Carter anymore. She wasn't the trusting wife who'd believed her husband's lies, who'd let herself be isolated and controlled and ultimately murdered. She was a trauma psychologist who specialized in understanding how people broke, how they hid their true natures behind carefully constructed facades, how they manipulated and gaslit and destroyed others while maintaining plausible deniability. She knew exactly how to dismantle someone like Nathan Carter. Not with violence. She'd never stooped to his level. Not with false accusations. She had too much respect for truth. But with patience, with intelligence, with the kind of long-game psychological warfare that would force him to reveal himself for what he truly was. Mira opened a new document on her laptop and began to type. Not a therapy note this time, but a plan. Step by step, meticulously detailed, accounting for every variable she could anticipate. She had no intention of confronting Nathan directly, of announcing herself as his supposedly dead wife returned from the grave. That would be dramatic, certainly, but ultimately ineffective. He'd simply deny everything, claim she was delusional or looking for money, use his resources and connections to discredit her before she could damage his reputation. No, Mira would do something much more effective. She would infiltrate his life, his campaign, his carefully constructed world of lies and manipulation. She would become someone he needed, someone he trusted, someone so essential to his success that he'd never suspect her true identity. And then, when he was most vulnerable, when he'd given her access to everything, she would expose him not as a vengeful ex-wife, but as a professional who'd uncovered evidence of fraud, conspiracy, and murder. She would use his own arrogance against him, his belief that Emily Carter was dead and buried, that he'd gotten away with the perfect crime, would blind him to the possibility that she could be standing right in front of him wearing a different name and a doctoral degree. The research phase took 6 weeks. Mira used every resource available to her. Public records, news archives, social media deep dives, professional databases she had access to through her university affiliations. She built a comprehensive profile of Nathan Carter's life since moving to Georgia, mapping his business deals, his political connections, his public appearances, his carefully curated social media presence. Nathan had done well for himself with Emily's insurance money. The initial Atlanta development deal had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, turning his $2.8 million into nearly $10 million within 3 years. He'd leveraged that success into more deals, bigger projects, higher profile developments. By the time he announced his city council candidacy, he was worth an estimated $25 million and was considered one of Georgia's most successful young developers. Lydia had been with him every step of the way, transitioning from mistress to wife to business partner with seamless efficiency. She ran the financial side of Carter Development, managing portfolios and investment strategies with the same cold precision she'd brought to everything else. In interviews, she was charming but controlled, speaking in sound bites about their shared vision for sustainable urban development and community revitalization. But Mira noticed something interesting in her research: cracks in the perfect facade. A business deal that had gone south 2 years ago, resulting in lawsuits that had been quietly settled out of court. Whispers on development forums about aggressive tactics and questionable business practices. A former employee who'd filed a complaint with the labor board, then mysteriously withdrawn it 3 weeks later. Nothing concrete, nothing that had gained mainstream attention, but enough to suggest that Nathan and Lydia's success wasn't quite as clean as their public image suggested. And then there was Evan Moore, Lydia's brother, the missing piece Mira had been looking for. A former attorney who'd been disbarred 5 years ago for ethics violations related to client funds. Evan now worked as a consultant for Carter Development. His role was vague, his presence in the organization carefully understated. He didn't appear in promotional materials or public events, but Mira found his name listed on business filings, on property deeds, on transfer documents that suggested he handled the aspects of Nathan's business that required legal knowledge without the scrutiny of an actively licensed attorney. This was her way in, not through Nathan directly, but through the campaign. Nathan was running for city council on a platform that emphasized business expertise and practical solutions to urban problems. His campaign materials stressed his background in development, his understanding of growth management, his vision for Ravenport's future. What the campaign needed, what Mira could provide, was behavioral expertise. Someone who could help him connect with voters on an emotional level, who could coach him through debates and public appearances, who could shape his messaging to resonate with different demographic groups. Mira crafted her application carefully, using her real credentials, but emphasizing aspects of her work that would appeal to a political campaign. Her expertise in communication strategies for trauma survivors translated perfectly to messaging development. Her research on how people process and respond to crisis situations was directly applicable to campaign strategy. Her papers on building trust and credibility in high-stakes situations were exactly what a first-time candidate would need. She sent the application through the campaign's official website, along with a cover letter that struck the perfect balance between professional and enthusiastic. Then she waited, knowing that her credentials were strong enough to at least warrant an interview, trusting that Nathan's ego would never allow him to recognize his dead wife in a successful doctor with 8 years of additional life experience etched into her face. The call came 3 days later. A campaign staffer named Marcus, young and eager, explaining that they'd been impressed with Dr. Lawson's background and would love to schedule an interview. Could she come to Ravenport next week? They'd cover travel expenses, of course, and if things went well, they'd be interested in bringing her on as a behavioral consultant for the remainder of the campaign season. Mira accepted with appropriate professional enthusiasm, hanging up the phone before allowing herself a moment to simply breathe through the wave of nausea that accompanied the realization of what she was about to do. She would be in the same room as the man who'd murdered her. She would shake his hand, smile at him, pretend she'd never met him before while watching for any sign of recognition that would destroy her entire plan. The flight to Ravenport felt endless. Mira used the time to review her strategy, to mentally prepare for the performance of her life. She'd spent years helping trauma survivors reconstruct their identities, teaching them how to exist in the world despite carrying wounds that never fully healed. Now she would apply those same skills to herself, becoming a version of Mira Lawson that bore no trace of Emily Carter beyond the knowledge that drove her forward. The campaign headquarters was located in a renovated warehouse in downtown Ravenport, all exposed brick and industrial chic design that screamed successful developer with artistic sensibilities. Mira walked through the doors exactly 15 minutes early, punctual but not desperate, and was greeted by Marcus, who looked exactly like his voice suggested. Mid-20s, expensive suit that he wore with slight discomfort, genuine enthusiasm about the campaign's prospects. "Dr. Lawson, thank you so much for coming," he said, shaking her hand with the vigor of someone who'd read too many books on making good first impressions. "Nathan's really excited to meet you. Your work on crisis communication strategies is exactly what we need right now. We've got a debate coming up against Councilwoman Martinez, and she's tough. We need someone who can help Nathan connect with voters on an emotional level without seeming manipulative or calculated." The irony wasn't lost on Mira. They wanted her to help Nathan seem authentic while hiding his true nature. Exactly the skill set he'd been using for years to hide the fact that he was a murderer. She was led to a conference room where Nathan waited with Lydia and 2 other campaign staffers. Mira had prepared herself for this moment, had practiced her reaction in front of a mirror until she could maintain perfect composure. But nothing could have truly prepared her for the reality of standing 5 feet from the man who'd pushed her off a cliff, who'd watched her fall, who'd calmly collected insurance money for her death while she fought to survive in a stranger's cabin. Nathan stood to greet her, extending his hand with a smile that had probably won him countless business deals and political endorsements. He was older now, the silver at his temples more pronounced, fine lines around his eyes that suggested stress he'd never admit to carrying. But his voice was the same, that smooth baritone that had once whispered promises and later demanded silence before shoving her toward oblivion. "Dr. Lawson, welcome. I've read your work. Truly impressive. Your paper on building authentic connections in high-stakes environments was particularly insightful." His handshake was firm but not aggressive, his eye contact steady but not intense. Everything about him was calibrated for maximum likability, maximum trust. Everything about him was a lie. "Mr. Carter, thank you for the opportunity," Mira said, and her voice was steady, professional, betraying nothing of the screaming horror that filled every cell of her body. "I'm excited to learn more about your campaign and explore how behavioral psychology might support your messaging strategy." She shook Lydia's hand next, looking into the eyes of the woman who'd helped plan her murder, who'd waited patiently for Emily to die so she could take her place in Nathan's life and business empire. Lydia's grip was cooler, more assessing. Where Nathan radiated practiced charm, Lydia projected controlled evaluation, her gaze sharp as she studied Mira for threats or weaknesses. "Your background is in trauma psychology," Lydia said, making it sound like an accusation rather than an observation. "That's quite different from political consulting." "The principles are more similar than you'd think," Mira replied smoothly, having anticipated this challenge. "Both involve understanding how people process information during high-stress situations, how they make decisions when emotional stakes are elevated, how they determine who to trust when faced with competing narratives. The specific context changes, but the underlying psychology remains constant." The interview lasted 90 minutes. They asked about her approach to messaging development, her thoughts on Nathan's public persona, her recommendations for the upcoming debate. Mira answered each question with the expertise she genuinely earned through 8 years of intensive study and clinical work, all while maintaining the internal division between Dr. Mira Lawson, professional consultant, and Emily Carter, survivor of attempted murder. Nathan was impressed. She could see it in the way he leaned forward when she spoke, in the questions he asked that suggested he was already imagining how her insights could be applied to his campaign. Lydia was more skeptical, but Mira had expected that. Lydia was the strategist, the one who saw threats before they materialized, the one whose instincts would be screaming that something felt off about this polished doctor with her impressive credentials and slightly too perfect fit for their needs. "We'll be in touch within 48 hours, Nathan said at the end of the interview, standing to shake her hand again. "But I'll be honest, Dr. Lawson, I'm already convinced. You understand what we're trying to build here. You get that politics isn't just about policy, it's about connection, about making people believe in a vision for their future. That's exactly what we need." Mira smiled, playing her role perfectly. "I appreciate your confidence, Mr. Carter. I look forward to potentially working together." She left the headquarters and made it exactly 3 blocks before pulling into an alley and vomiting behind a dumpster, her entire body shaking with the reality of what she'd just done. She'd shaken hands with her would-be murderer. She'd charmed the woman who'd helped plan her death. She'd presented herself as an asset to their continued success, all while knowing that her ultimate goal was their complete destruction. The job offer came the next morning. Generous compensation, flexible hours, the opportunity to shape campaign strategy during a crucial election cycle. Mira accepted immediately, asking questions about start dates and logistics that would have been appropriate for any consultant taking on a new client. Inside, she was already planning her next move, already thinking 3 steps ahead to how she would position herself as indispensable while gathering the evidence she needed to expose them all. But she couldn't do this alone. As much as she wanted to believe she could manipulate Nathan and Lydia into revealing themselves through psychological warfare alone, the reality was that she needed concrete evidence of their crimes. She needed documentation of the insurance fraud, of the suspicious circumstances around her death, of the business dealings that had built their empire on blood money. She needed someone who could investigate without triggering Nathan's suspicion, someone whose presence in his world would seem natural and unconnected to the consultant he'd just hired. She needed Julian Park. Mira had discovered Julian during her research phase, an investigative journalist based in Atlanta who'd written extensively about corruption in development deals, about the ways wealthy developers manipulated zoning laws and city councils to enrich themselves at public expense. His work was thorough, well-sourced, and fearless. He'd taken on powerful people before and won, his articles leading to indictments and policy reforms. More importantly, Julian had briefly covered one of Nathan's business deals 3 years ago, noting irregularities in how quickly permits had been approved, raising questions about whether proper oversight procedures had been followed. The article hadn't gained much traction. Nathan's lawyers had threatened litigation, and Julian's editor had killed the follow-up piece, but it demonstrated that Julian already had suspicions about Nathan Carter's business practices. Mira reached out through Julian's professional website, requesting a meeting to discuss potential collaboration on a story about political candidates with questionable business backgrounds. She was careful not to mention Nathan specifically in her initial contact, not to reveal the personal nature of her interest. As far as Julian knew, she was simply a psychologist with concerns about a candidate who seemed too good to be true. They met at a coffee shop in Atlanta, neutral territory where neither of them would be recognized. Julian was younger than she'd expected, early 30s, with the kind of intensity that suggested he took his work personally, that he saw journalism as a calling rather than just a career. He listened as Mira laid out what she knew about Nathan Carter's rise from Colorado developer to Georgia political candidate, about the timeline that put his initial capital influx right after his wife's convenient death, about the business associates whose backgrounds suggested they might not be entirely ethical in their dealings. "Why come to me with this?" Julian asked, his eyes sharp as he studied her across the table. "You're a psychologist, not a journalist. What's your stake in taking down Nathan Carter?" Mira had prepared for this question, had decided in advance how much truth to reveal. "I work with trauma survivors," she said carefully. "I've seen too many cases where powerful men hurt women and face no consequences because the system protects wealth and influence over justice. Nathan Carter's story has too many convenient coincidences. His wife dies under suspicious circumstances, he receives millions in insurance money, he relocates and builds an empire. I don't have proof he did anything wrong, but I have enough questions that I think someone should be asking them. It wasn't the full truth, but it wasn't a lie either." Julian studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I looked into Carter before," he admitted. 3 years ago, after that permit approval story. But his lawyers came down hard, and my editor got nervous. I had to drop it, but I never stopped wondering if there was more there. If I'd given up on a story that mattered because someone with money told me to back off. "So let's find out," Mira said. "I'm starting as a consultant on his campaign next week. I'll have access to internal communications, strategy sessions, private conversations. You investigate the business side, the deals, the money trails, the Colorado history. Between us, we can build a complete picture of who Nathan Carter really is." Julian was quiet for a moment, weighing the risks and ethical implications. Finally, he extended his hand across the table. "Partners," he said, "but we do this right. No fabricated evidence, no entrapment, no crossing lines that would make the story unusable even if we find something. If Nathan Carter is dirty, we expose him with facts that will hold up in court and in print." "Agreed," Mira said, shaking his hand and feeling something like hope for the first time since she'd seen Nathan's face on that television screen. She wasn't alone in this anymore. She had an ally, someone who understood that justice sometimes required patience and strategy rather than immediate confrontation. The campaign work began the following Monday. Mira established herself quickly as an invaluable asset, providing insights into voter psychology that helped Nathan refine his messaging, coaching him through media appearances with advice that made him seem more authentic and relatable. She was professional, competent, and just enthusiastic enough about his candidacy to seem genuine without appearing sycophantic. Nathan loved her. Within 2 weeks, he was consulting her on everything from debate preparation to social media strategy to how he should position himself on controversial policy issues. He trusted her completely, never suspecting that the doctor helping him win voter trust was the wife he'd murdered standing right in front of him, wearing a different name, and 8 years of hard-earned survival. But Lydia remained suspicious. Mira could feel it in the way Lydia watched her during strategy meetings, in the questions Lydia asked that seemed designed to test Myra's loyalty and motives. Lydia was the real threat. Her instincts were sharper than Nathan's ego would ever allow his to be, her paranoia a natural defense mechanism that had probably kept them from being caught years ago. Mira adjusted her strategy accordingly. She made a point of deferring to Lydia on financial matters, of praising her business acumen in front of Nathan, of positioning herself as someone who understood and respected the partnership that had built Carter Development into what it was. Slowly, grudgingly, Lydia's suspicion began to thaw into something approaching professional respect. Meanwhile, Julian was making progress on the investigative front. He'd contacted sources in Stonehaven, including Detective Sarah Brennan, who'd never fully believed Nathan's story about Emily's accidental fall. Brennan was retired now, but she still had copies of the case file, still remembered the details that had bothered her 8 years ago. The life insurance policy taken out just months before Emily's death, Nathan's too-perfect grief performance, the convenient timing of his relationship with Lydia becoming public right after the insurance payout cleared. She thinks he killed his wife, Julian told Mira during one of their clandestine meetings at an out-of-the-way diner. She just couldn't prove it. No body, no witnesses, no evidence of foul play beyond her gut instinct that something was wrong. But she kept the file. She's been keeping tabs on Nathan Carter for 8 years, waiting for him to slip up. Then we give her what she needs, Mira said. We get him to confess. Not to us, he'd never admit anything to strangers. But we make him think he's safe, that enough time has passed that he can afford to be honest about what really happened that night. The opportunity came during debate preparation 6 weeks into Myra's time with the campaign. Nathan was struggling with a question about family values, about how personal tragedy had shaped his policy positions. The moderator in the practice session had asked about his late first wife, and Nathan had fumbled the response, his usual smooth delivery faltering when confronted with memories he'd worked hard to bury. Afterward, when the other staffers had left and it was just Mira and Nathan in the conference room, she saw her opening. That question about Emily rattled you, she said, keeping her tone professional and concerned. We need to address it head-on, develop a narrative you're comfortable with, so it doesn't throw you off during the actual debate. Nathan's jaw tightened. It was 8 years ago. I don't understand why people still want to talk about it. Because it's part of your story, Mira said gently, moving closer, adopting the therapeutic tone she used with clients when encouraging them to confront difficult truths. You lost your wife and unborn child in a tragic accident. That kind of loss shapes a person. Voters respond to authenticity, to vulnerability. If you can talk about that night with genuine emotion, it becomes an asset rather than a liability. What if I don't want to talk about it? Nathan snapped, and for just a moment, Mira saw the real man beneath the political facade, angry, defensive, dangerous. What if some things should stay buried? Then they will, Mira assured him. But unprocessed grief has a way of surfacing at inconvenient times. I've seen it happen to people in high-pressure situations. The trauma they've been suppressing for years comes out during a critical moment, a debate, an interview, a crisis, and it destroys everything they've built. She let that sink in, watching Nathan's face as he processed the implicit threat in her words. Not a threat from her, as far as he knew, but from his own unresolved emotions. I can help you, she continued. That's literally what I do. I help people process traumatic experiences so they can move forward without being controlled by their past. But I can only help if you're honest with me about what actually happened that night." Nathan looked at her for a long moment, and Mira could see him calculating, weighing whether the risk of honesty was worth the potential benefit of being able to discuss Emily's death without falling apart. Finally, he sighed, and when he spoke, his voice carried an edge of something that might have been regret if she hadn't known better. "Emily found out about Lydia," he said. "She found documents, financial records, text messages. She was going to leave me, and if she left, she'd take half of everything I'd built. More than half, actually, because most of the capital for my business came from her inheritance. She had leverage, and she was going to use it to destroy me." Mira kept her expression neutral, her body language open and non-judgmental. This was the most critical moment. If Nathan sensed any hint of accusation or horror, he'd shut down completely. "That must have been terrifying," she said. "Facing the loss of everything you'd worked for." "She wouldn't listen to reason," Nathan continued, the words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken. "I tried to explain that Lydia was just business, that what Emily and I had was real, but she'd made up her mind. So I suggested we go for a drive, talk it out away from the house where everything reminded her of the betrayal. Blackridge Canyon seemed like a good place, quiet, private, somewhere we could really communicate." "But it didn't work," Mira prompted gently. "She was standing too close to the edge," Nathan said, and his voice had gone flat, emotionless. "The wind was strong. I reached for her, tried to pull her back, and she just fell. It happened so fast. 1 second she was there, and the next she was gone." It was a masterful lie, Mira had to admit. The story was constructed carefully enough to sound like the truth, while containing just enough vagueness to avoid actionable admissions of guilt. He'd reached for her. She'd fallen. An accident, tragic, unavoidable. But Mira had been there. She remembered his hand on her shoulder, the deliberate pressure, the cold calculation in his eyes as he'd pushed her toward death. She'd lived through the reality of what Nathan was now whitewashing into a narrative of innocent tragedy. "That must have been devastating," she said, and her voice was steady even as every part of her screamed to call him a liar, a murderer, a monster. "To lose your wife and child in an instant, to be unable to save them despite being right there." "The insurance money helped," Nathan said, and there was something ugly in his voice now, something that suggested he'd moved past whatever thin veneer of remorse he'd been performing. "I won't pretend it didn't. Emily's death was tragic, but it also freed me to build the business I'd always envisioned. Lydia understood my vision in ways Emily never had. We took that insurance payout and turned it into an empire." There it was, not quite a confession, but close enough. Nathan Carter admitting that his wife's death had been financially beneficial, that he'd used the insurance money to fund his success, that he felt no real guilt about any of it. Mira could see in his eyes that he believed he'd gotten away with it, that 8 years of distance and success had made him feel untouchable. He had no idea that every word he'd just spoken had been recorded by the device Mira had sewn into the lining of her blazer. He had no idea that Julian was currently pulling financial records that showed suspicious transfers of funds right before Emily's death, suggesting premeditation. He had no idea that Detective Brennan was standing by, ready to reopen the investigation the moment she had probable cause. Nathan thought he was safe. He thought he was confiding in a trusted consultant who'd help him craft the perfect narrative about tragic loss and resilience. He had no idea he was talking to his supposedly dead wife, who'd spent 8 years becoming someone strong enough, smart enough, and patient enough to take him down. But Mira didn't reveal herself. Not yet. Because Nathan wasn't the only one who needed to fall. Lydia had been part of this from the beginning, and Evan Moore had helped them cover their tracks. Mira wanted all of them. A complete accounting of everyone who'd profited from her attempted murder. The breakthrough came 2 weeks later, during a private campaign fundraiser at Nathan and Lydia's home. Mira had been invited as part of the inner circle, trusted enough now to attend events where donors wrote 6-figure checks and discussed policy positions over catered hors d'oeuvres and expensive wine. She'd worn a wire, of course. Julian had provided military-grade recording equipment that was virtually undetectable, sewn into the seams of her dress by a contact he had in law enforcement. Everything she heard, every conversation, was being captured for evidence. Lydia cornered her in the kitchen, away from the guests, her expression troubled. "Can we talk?" she asked, pouring herself a glass of wine that she downed in 2 long swallows. "Off the record." Consultant to consultant. "Of course," Mira said, her heart racing but her expression calm. "What's on your mind?" "Nathan's been different lately," Lydia said, refilling her glass. More relaxed, almost relieved. "He told me he talked to you about Emily, about that night. He said it helped, having someone professional to process it with." She looked at Mira with eyes that carried 8 years of buried guilt. "Did he tell you what really happened?" This was it, the moment Mira had been waiting for. She could feel the wire recording against her skin, capturing every word. "He told me about the accident," Mira said carefully. "About trying to pull her back and being unable to save her." Lydia laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. "Is that what he said? That it was an accident?" She shook her head, downing more wine. "Nathan's always been good at rewriting history, at turning murder into tragedy, at making himself the victim of circumstances beyond his control." Mira said nothing, letting the silence stretch, knowing that Lydia was drunk enough, troubled enough, that she might say more if given space. And she did. "I told him it was a mistake," Lydia continued, her words slurring slightly. "Told him there were other ways to handle Emily's threats. But he was convinced she'd destroy everything, take all the money, ruin his reputation. So he planned it, planned every detail. The drive to the canyon, the argument designed to get her close to the edge, the push that he could explain away as an accident, if anyone questioned it." She looked at Mira with eyes that begged for absolution. "I wasn't even there that night. But I helped him set it up. I helped him plan it. That makes me just as guilty, doesn't it?" "Yes," Mira said quietly. "Yes, it does." Lydia froze, something in Mira's tone finally penetrating through the alcohol and guilt. "What did you say?" "I said yes, it makes you guilty. Conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud. Probably a dozen other charges once the district attorney gets finished reviewing all the evidence we've been collecting for the past 2 months." Mira pulled the recording device from her dress, holding it up so Lydia could see the red light indicating it was still running. "Everything you just said has been recorded. Everything Nathan told me 2 weeks ago was recorded. And my partner has been building a financial case that proves premeditation." The color drained from Lydia's face. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Someone you should have made sure was actually dead before you moved into her house and spent her money," Mira said. And she felt a savage satisfaction at the horror that bloomed in Lydia's eyes as the impossible truth registered. "Emily," Lydia breathed. "But you died. You fell. There was no body, but the search teams found blood and a phone, but no body," Mira finished. "Because I survived. I crawled out of that river broken and blank, with no memory of who I was or what had been done to me. But I got those memories back, Lydia. And then I got my doctorate. And then I got justice. Or I will. As soon as Detective Brennan arrives with the arrest warrants she's been waiting 8 years to serve." As if on cue, sirens sounded outside. Lydia's glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the tile floor in a spray of wine and crystal. In the main room, Mira could hear confusion, raised voices, Nathan demanding to know what was happening. Detective Brennan walked through the front door with 3 uniformed officers and a pair of handcuffs that had Nathan Carter's name written all over them. Julian stood behind them, camera in hand, documenting everything for the story that would run in newspapers across the country by morning. "Nathan Carter," Brennan said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a detective who'd finally gotten her man. "You're under arrest for the murder of Emily Carter, insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. Lydia Carter, Evan Moore, you're both under arrest as accessories to murder and conspiracy to commit fraud." The campaign donors scattered like startled birds. Nathan tried to run but was tackled by officers before he made it to the back door. Evan, who'd been hiding in his room trying to erase files from his laptop, was dragged out screaming about lawyers and constitutional rights. And Lydia just stood in the kitchen, staring at Mira with an expression of absolute defeat. "How?" she asked. "How did you survive?" "Someone pulled me out of the river," Mira said. "Someone who believed I deserved a second chance. And I spent 8 years becoming someone strong enough to make sure you and Nathan never hurt anyone else." She paused, watching as officers cuffed Lydia and began reading her rights. You should have checked for a body, Lydia. You should have made absolutely certain I was dead before you celebrated my murder. The trial lasted 6 weeks and became a media sensation. Julian's investigation had uncovered evidence of premeditation. Text messages between Nathan and Lydia discussing how to handle the Emily problem. Financial transfers made days before her death. A draft will Nathan had drawn up that cut Emily out completely. Combined with the recordings of Nathan's admission and Lydia's confession, the prosecution built an airtight case. Nathan and Lydia were both convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and insurance fraud. Nathan received life in prison without possibility of parole. Lydia got 25 years. Evan Moore, who'd helped them launder money and falsify documents in the aftermath, received 15 years as an accessory after the fact. But for Mira, the real victory came not in the courtroom but in a small conference room at Georgia Family Services, where a social worker sat across from her with a file that held the answer to a question that had haunted her for 8 years. "Your son's name is Noah," the social worker said gently. "He was adopted by a family here in Georgia when he was 3 months old. They're good people, loving, stable, prepared for the possibility that his biological mother might resurface someday. Given the circumstances of the case, given the evidence that you were a victim and that Noah was taken from you through no fault of your own, the court has ruled that you have the right to contact if you choose to pursue it." Noah was 7 years old now, with dark hair like Emily's and eyes that held shadows suggesting he'd always somehow known his story began with loss. The adoptive parents, Sarah and Marcus Brennan, the detective who'd helped bring Nathan to justice, and her husband, welcomed Mira into their home with kindness that made her cry. "He's known he was adopted since he was old enough to understand," Sarah Brennan said. "We've always told him that his birth mother loved him, that she wanted him, that she was taken from him by circumstances beyond anyone's control. When we saw the news about your case, about who you really were, we knew we had to reach out." Noah stood in the doorway, shy and uncertain, studying Mira with the intense focus of a child trying to understand something too big for words. "Are you really my mom?" he asked. Mira knelt down, bringing herself to his eye level. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm really your mom. And I have thought about you every single day for 7 years. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there for you. I'm so sorry someone took that choice away from both of us." Noah considered this for a long moment. Then he stepped forward and hugged her with the fierce grip of a child who'd been waiting for this moment without knowing it. Mira held him and cried, not tears of grief this time, but of overwhelming gratitude that he existed, that he'd been loved and cared for by people who'd given him everything she couldn't. They worked out an arrangement, visits at first, gradually increasing as Noah got comfortable, with the goal of eventual shared custody. Sarah and Marcus would always be his parents, the people who'd raised him and loved him through all the years Mira had missed. But Mira would be part of his life now too, a second mother who'd fought her way back from death to reclaim the son that had been stolen from her. 2 years later, Mira and Noah stood together at Blackridge Canyon. She'd avoided this place since the trial, the memories still too raw, the cliff still too full of ghosts. But Noah had asked to see it. He was 9 now, old enough to understand the story of what had happened there, mature enough to process that his origin included violence and survival in equal measure. They stood well back from the edge, the wind carrying the scent of pine and possibility. Noah slipped his hand into hers, small and warm and alive. "This is where it happened," he said. "Not a question, just acknowledgement." "Yes," Mira said. "This is where someone tried to erase me, tried to erase us. But they couldn't," Noah said, squeezing her hand. "Because you're too strong. Because you survived and you came back and you stopped them." Mira looked down at her son, this miracle of resilience and hope, and felt something shift inside her. The rage that had driven her for so long, the need for justice that had consumed 8 years of her life, finally began to ease. Not disappearing entirely, some scars ran too deep for that, but softening into something that felt like peace. "I survived because I had to," she said. "Because you existed. Because somewhere out there, I had a son who deserved to know his mother fought for him, even when she didn't remember who she was." They stood there for a long time, looking not down into the canyon but forward, toward the horizon where the sun was setting in shades of orange and gold. Emily Carter had died in this place, pushed off a cliff by a man who saw her as an obstacle to be eliminated. But Dr. Mira Lawson had been born from that death, forged in trauma and loss, and as someone stronger, someone who understood that survival meant more than simply staying alive. If you've watched this story from beginning to end, drop a comment and let us know what you think about Emily's journey from victim to survivor to the woman who brought her attackers to justice. Hit that like button if you believe in the power of resilience and the importance of never giving up, no matter how impossible the situation seems. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss stories of survival, justice, and the strength of the human spirit. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that they're stronger than whatever tried to break them. Because in the end, Nathan Carter had been right about one thing. Emily Carter did die that night at Blackridge Canyon. She died so that someone stronger, someone unbreakable, someone who would never again be anyone's victim could take her place. They tried to erase her. Instead, they created the woman who ended them. And that woman was standing at the edge of the canyon with her son, looking not back at what had been lost, but forward toward everything they'd gained. The wind picked up, carrying their laughter across the canyon as they turned away from the cliff and walked together toward the car, toward home, toward a future that belonged entirely to them. Behind them, the canyon stood silent and eternal, witness to both death and resurrection, a reminder that sometimes the fall isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's just the beginning.